I still recall the day I moved into Bloomfield Heights, the air perfumed by rows of hydrangeas and ornamental cherry trees lining each cul-de-sac. After years of renting an apartment in a noisy city, I yearned for a serene, flower-filled suburb. My new home promised a spacious yard, a neat front walkway, and, best of all, plenty of sunlit soil for my beloved rose bushes. I'd spent my 20s dabbling in horticulture, falling in love with heirloom roses and rare ornamental blooms. So, upon arriving at Bloomfield Heights, I envisioned a gardener's paradise, neighbors sharing seed packets, exchanging tips on fertilizer, and throwing friendly yard sales. Little did I know that behind the picturesque calm lurked a single, intimidating presence. Brenda Arndell, widely branded by the locals as Karen. That first weekend, as I strolled along the sidewalk to admire the community greenbelts, I saw a small sign reading, "Notice, do not pick community flowers, subject to fine." I found it odd. Typically, neighborhoods might discourage litter or request not to damage landscaping, but finding someone for plucking a stray bloom felt extreme. When I asked a passing dog walker about it, she shrugged. "That's Brenda for you. She's on the HOA board and insists we protect every petal from being vandalized." She threatened to fine me once for letting my daughter pick a single daisy. I almost laughed, thinking it must be an exaggeration. But Harriet, my next-door neighbor, a kindly retiree, later confirmed it. Karen runs Bloomfield's HOA compliance. She's furious about people snipping the wildflowers or daisies that grow along the pathways. She thinks it ruins the neighborhood's symmetrical landscaping. Harriet sighed. She posted those signs last year and threatened to charge $25 for each illegally picked flower. It's ridiculous, but folks are too intimidated to fight her. At the time, I thought, well, as long as I don't pick public blooms, we won't clash. My plan was to cultivate my own private rose garden. Little did I suspect Karen's meddling would one day lead her right into my yard under cover of night, aiming to snag the very roses I cherished. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into transforming my yard into a personal Eden. I'd ordered specialized rose cuttings from a boutique grower, including the elusive Lady Harriet, a rare Victorian-era rose famed for its layered petals and lush fragrance. My vision was a swirl of pinks, reds, and creams, climbing over trellises and forming a colorful tapestry along the fence. Each morning, I'd water them and carefully check for pests, hoping they'd flourish in Bloomfield Heights' temperate climate. As the new neighbor, I made an effort to greet folks, chatting politely about yard maintenance or the local park. Several were friendly, though many offered cautionary tales about Brenda Karen Arndell. They called her the flower enforcer, referencing her obsession with safeguarding the communal flower beds. She'd publicly scold children if they tried picking daisies for a bouquet. She even warned an elderly man for harvesting a small cluster of lavender as a gift for his granddaughter. The rumor was that Brenda had a particular mania for controlling anything involving blooms. Despite these oddities, I hoped our paths wouldn't cross in conflict. I wasn't messing with public flowers. After all, my interest lay solely in my private garden. So I carried on, occasionally noticing Brenda's crisp silhouette as she patrolled the sidewalks, notepad in hand. She was in her early 50s, impeccably dressed even during casual hours, with hair pinned back in a style reminiscent of old-fashioned severity. If she caught sight of me, she'd nod curtly, eyes flicking to my rose bushes as though appraising for potential infractions. I distinctly remember Harriet's wry remark, "Wait until your roses bloom. Karen might find a reason to regulate them." I thought Harriet was joking. However, Harriet's half-smile hinted at a deeper awareness. In Bloomfield Heights, no flower was safe from Brenda's scrutiny. True to rumor, a month into my new life at Bloomfield Heights, I discovered an official-looking letter in my mailbox. The HOA letterhead adorned the top, but the text clearly reflected Brenda's tone. "Dear resident, it has come to my attention that certain neighbors are planting new rose varieties. While we encourage tasteful horticulture, please be reminded, picking or removing flowers from communal grounds is strictly prohibited. We appreciate your cooperation in preserving Bloomfield's aesthetic. Repeated infractions or encouragement of picking public blooms may incur fines." I read it twice, perplexed. My roses were in my private yard. The letter didn't accuse me outright, but the timing was odd. Why mention picking from communal grounds if I hadn't done so? Perhaps it was a blanket reminder. But Harriet guessed otherwise. Karen's known to send passive-aggressive letters, so you're on notice. She suspects you're a hardcore gardener, might harvest wildflowers or encourage others to do so. The notion of an HOA policing harvesting from communal grounds seemed overblown, but I shrugged. My main focus was my personal rose garden, not the public daisies or orchard blossoms. So I ignored the letter, continuing my daily routine of tending my carefully nurtured rose cuttings. The only difference was the mild annoyance in the pit of my stomach, sensing Brenda's watchful presence. Harriet urged me to keep all correspondence, in case future disputes arose. So I tucked the letter into a binder labeled HOA Notices. At that point, I had no inkling that Brenda's pompous stance about protecting the neighborhood's blooms would soon lead to an epic display of hypocrisy. As spring advanced into early summer, my rose bushes finally began to flourish. The Lady Harriet variety was particularly striking, bursting with layered petals in a dusky pink hue. Their fragrance wafted across the yard, turning heads of passers-by. I'd often catch neighbors slowing to admire the blossoms behind my low fence. Harriet raved about the perfume, occasionally asking if she could bury her nose in a single bloom, which I happily allowed on my property, no picking needed. The sweet sense of achievement warmed my heart. One afternoon, while I was trimming wilted leaves, I noticed Brenda, Karen, lingering on the sidewalk outside my fence, arms folded. She gazed at the roses with a curious expression, half admiration, half calculation. For a moment, she gave me a polite smile. "They're quite striking," she murmured. "Where did you find that particular variety? I haven't seen it around here." I explained I'd ordered specialized cuttings from a distant grower. She nodded, almost impressed, then added, "Well, do be mindful. We wouldn't want folks snipping these for bouquets. That's how community blossoms get depleted." Before I could respond, she turned and walked off, leaving me with a strange mix of pride at her grudging compliment and annoyance at her assumption that someone else might steal my flowers. Little did I suspect it would be her. That evening, Harriet joked, "Karen's got her eyes on your roses. Don't be surprised if she tries to incorporate them into her personal decorating rules or something." We laughed, but her words rang with a premonitory undertone. Over time, I'd see Brenda passing by more frequently, sometimes slowing to stare at the luscious pink blooms swaying behind my fence. Harriet teased me. Maybe she's jealous. Or maybe she wants them for herself. We both found that idea ridiculous at the time. Who would risk their reputation for a few cut flowers? If only we'd known how brazen Brenda could be when it suited her purposes. Meanwhile, Brenda amped up her campaign against picking flowers along the neighborhood's pathways. She posted fresh signs near the pond. "Do not pick blooms. $25 fine per stem. Report violations." She pestered the HOA board to adopt stricter flora preservation measures. Some neighbors grumbled that a child gathering daisies could face a penalty. Harriet recounted how a teenage girl got scolded by Brenda for tucking a wild daisy behind her ear. Brenda's reasoning: "We must keep the community's floral displays intact for everyone to enjoy." At an HOA meeting, Brenda presented slides about vandalism of public blooms. She insisted new cameras be installed near the main flower beds, urging fines for even minor plucking. A few board members looked uncomfortable, but Brenda argued the measures were necessary. The final outcome was a tepid compromise: more signage, but no new cameras just yet. I attended, quietly observing her fervor about punishing flower picking. She invoked phrases like sanctity of neighborhood flora, preserving beauty, respectful observation, not destruction. She was near evangelical on the topic. Despite her zeal, the actual theft of public flowers was minimal or non-existent. Most residents avoided picking them due to fear of Brenda's wrath. So the whole campaign felt like overkill, a big fuss over a tiny issue. But for Brenda, it was a moral crusade. She proudly hammered in more signs, repeating her warnings to onlookers, as though she believed she was Bloomfield's savior of petals. In some ways, I admired her dedication to horticulture, but her authoritarian approach rubbed me the wrong way. Harriet shook her head. "It's not about the flowers. It's about control." Still, none of us anticipated that the champion of no picking would soon stoop to sneaking into my yard for a personal flower raid. Midsummer rolled in, bringing warm evenings and vibrant blossoms. One day, Harriet reported that Brenda was planning a lavish garden party at her home for a select circle of Bloomfield Heights residents, mainly board members, local socialites, and a few influential neighbors. Harriet wasn't invited, nor was I, which suited me fine. From the whispers, it sounded like a formal event with white tablecloths, fancy centerpieces, and an aim to showcase Brenda's immaculate yard. She'd be unveiling her newly renovated patio, rumored to cost a small fortune. A week before the party, Brenda surprised me by knocking on my door. She asked if I'd consider providing some rose cuttings to adorn the table centerpieces at her event. The request was framed politely, but with a subtle sense of entitlement. "Your Lady Harriet roses are so unique. It would be wonderful if you donated a few stems to represent Bloomfield's horticultural excellence," she said, smiling that stiff-lipped grin. I felt a surge of annoyance. This was the same woman who threatened everyone else for picking flowers. Now she wanted my private blooms for her party, presumably to flaunt them. Part of me considered it, but I'd spent months cultivating those roses. They were not cheap or easily replaced. Also, her arrogance and the way she demanded donation rubbed me the wrong way. So I politely declined. "I appreciate your interest, but I prefer to keep my blooms intact on the bushes for the season. They're delicate and in their prime right now. Perhaps you can find similar roses at a florist?" Her smile wavered. "Oh, but a florist's roses might not be as fresh or distinctive as yours." "Are you sure?" "It would only be a few stems." I held firm. "I'm quite certain. I'm sorry, but they're not available for cutting." Brenda's face tightened, but she masked it quickly. "Well," she said, "it's your choice. Thank you for considering it." Then she left with an icy undertone in her voice. Harriet, upon hearing this, snorted. "Unbelievable. She's the self-appointed bloom police, yet wants your private roses for free? That's Brenda for you." A few days passed. I continued my normal routines, occasionally glimpsing Brenda's minions, fellow board members, hurrying to finalize details for her big soiree. Meanwhile, my rose bushes thrived, the prized Lady Harriet variety forming a breathtaking cluster. Harriet teased me. "Your yard's more stunning than any florist's window display. No wonder Brenda wants them for her party." Then came subtle hints that something was off. Twice, I noticed footprints in the soft soil near my fence, leading me to wonder if someone had tried to reach over. Another morning, I found a broken twig on the ground, suspiciously near a rose bush, though no flowers seemed missing. I chalked it up to a stray cat or a gust of wind. Harriet suggested we keep an eye out. Brenda might be tempted to get those roses somehow. To ease my mind, I installed a simple security camera over my garage, angled to capture the front yard and portion of the side fence. I mainly intended it for general security, package theft, or random trespassers. If someone messed with my roses, I wanted evidence. Harriet thought it might be overkill, but I felt no harm in being prepared. Meanwhile, Bloomfield buzzed about Brenda's party. Set for a Saturday evening, it promised to be the event of the summer. People speculated about the elaborate decorations, the expensive caterers. Some cynics rolled their eyes at her desire to impress. I overheard one neighbor mention that Brenda had a bizarre competition with a friend in a neighboring community, each trying to outdo the other's yard parties. Knowing how petty Brenda could be, I suspected she'd leave no stone unturned in pursuit of the perfect aesthetic. The night before Brenda's party, I fell asleep early, exhausted from a busy work week. Sometime past midnight, a faint rustling noise roused me. Half awake, I convinced myself it was just the wind or a random critter. I drifted back to sleep, unaware of the real culprit. A stealthy figure creeping through my yard, clippers in hand. When I woke at dawn to water the roses, I instantly saw something was wrong. Several prime Lady Harriet blooms had vanished. Freshly snipped stems indicated a clean cut. My heart pounded as I surveyed the damage. At least half a dozen of my best, fullest flowers were gone. Anger and disbelief churned in my stomach. Who would do this? A neighbor, a random thief? Harriet's warnings about Brenda flashed through my mind, but it seemed too brazen. Could she stoop that low? I scrambled to check my newly installed security camera footage. Sure enough, at around 12:45 a.m., the camera captured a hooded figure slipping through the side gate. They had some difficulty, eventually pushing the latch. The shape, though obscured, seemed feminine, wearing a long, loose coat. For a moment, the face flickered into partial view. A flash of sharp features, short hair. Then the person crouched near my rose bushes, snipping away. The figure left quickly, holding a small bundle, presumably of stolen blooms. They hopped back over a low part of the fence, vanishing into the night. Enraged, I rewound, analyzing the face. Though the camera's angle was poor, I recognized enough. The posture, the hair color. It looked suspiciously like Brenda. Ms. Don't pick the community flowers. Ms. Stop all picking. Harriet confirmed my suspicion. She has that distinctive posture and haircut. I'd bet my house it's her. A swirl of fury and bizarre amusement overtook me. The woman who threatened everyone else with fines for flower picking had literally stolen my private roses for her chic party. My beloved, carefully cultivated heirloom blooms. Harriet convinced me not to confront Brenda alone, but to gather more evidence. So I saved the footage on a USB stick, documenting the time and date. Then I planned my next move. That evening was the big day of Brenda's garden party. I half expected an apology note or some explanation from her, but none arrived. Instead, Harriet and I peered from across the street as an array of fancy cars pulled up near Brenda's house. Guests in elegant attire streamed into her backyard, which glowed with string lights and polished centerpieces. Waiters bustled about with trays of champagne. It was indeed an ostentatious affair. Harriet, bristling with curiosity, decided to stroll down the sidewalk for a discreet peek at the decor. I followed at a distance. Through the fence slats and from vantage points, we glimpsed lavish floral arrangements on each table. Sure enough, we saw pale pink roses in tall vases, the exact shade and fullness of my Lady Harriet's. My stomach churned. She hadn't even tried to disguise them. One arrangement near the buffet station featured the largest cluster of pink blooms, anchored by some store-bought lilies. Harriet muttered under her breath. She used your stolen roses for the center display. The nerve! A wave of anger rose in me. This was my property. Expensive, carefully cultivated, taken without permission. And the fact that Brenda ironically ranted about not picking flowers made it even more galling. We retreated to Harriet's porch. She poured me a glass of iced tea to calm my nerves. What now? She asked. Do you barge in, cause a scene? I shook my head. As tempting as that was, I wanted a more definitive approach. I have the video. I can show it to the HOA board. She's literally violating property rights. And she stole something quite valuable. Harriet smiled. Oh, that will cause quite a scandal. But she deserves it. I spent the remainder of the night stewing in frustration, imagining my beautiful roses displayed for Brenda's high society crowd, while she boasted about locally sourced blooms. I resolved that come Monday, I'd present my evidence to the HOA in an official complaint. Let Brenda face the consequences of her hypocrisy. First thing Monday morning, I emailed the HOA board, requesting an urgent meeting about a violation of property rights. Ms. Delgado, a board member with a reputation for fairness, replied quickly, scheduling me for a slot that afternoon at the HOA office. Harriet accompanied me as moral support. We arrived with a printout of still frames from the security footage, plus the actual video on a USB drive. Ms. Delgado and two other board members greeted us in a small conference room. Brenda was notably absent, ironically. I explained that I had solid proof showing Brenda sneaking into my yard at night, cutting my rare roses without permission. Harriet corroborated my timeline. Then I played the short clip on Ms. Delgado's laptop. Despite the hood, the angle showing Brenda's partial face was fairly convincing. The board members looked aghast. Ms. Delgado frowned. This is extremely concerning. Ms. Arndel has repeatedly championed protecting flowers. She insisted on that fine structure for picking public blooms. Now she's apparently stolen private flowers? This is serious. Another board member, Mr. Hall, commented, legally, this is trespassing and theft. Are you seeking compensation? I calmly said yes. I wanted reimbursement for the stolen roses, which cost me a premium and took months to cultivate. I also insisted she formally acknowledge wrongdoing. Harriet chimed in that if we let this slide, it sets a terrible precedent. The same official haranguing others for petty flower picking is committing a bigger offense. The board agreed to summon Brenda for a hearing. Ms. Delgado assured me they'd treat it with utmost seriousness. Harriet gave me a satisfied nod. Finally, we'd have a chance to expose her hypocrisy. 2 days later, the board convened a special session, with me and Harriet in attendance, along with Brenda. She arrived in a sleek pastel pantsuit, looking tense. Ms. Delgado outlined the accusation that Brenda illegally entered my yard late at night, cutting prized rose blooms for her party. Brenda's eyes widened in feigned shock. She immediately denied it. Preposterous, she hissed. Why would I, someone who advocates protecting blooms, do such a thing? This must be a misunderstanding or an attempt to tarnish my reputation. Ms. Delgado calmly showed the security footage on a projector. The grainy images of a hooded figure were displayed. The glimpses of Brenda's face were partial, but telling. Brenda sputtered, "That's not me. Anyone could wear a hood. This is inconclusive. People have similar hair color. It's a smear tactic." I was home, preparing for my event. Harriet and I exchanged glances. The board pressed further. Ms. Delgado pointed out how the figure's silhouette, posture, and partial facial view matched Brenda's. They asked about the roses at her party. Brenda admitted she had pink roses, but claimed she purchased them from a local florist. Ms. Delgado suggested we call that florist to verify. Brenda's face blanched, knowing any such store receipt likely didn't exist. She stammered that perhaps she'd thrown away the receipt. Then Harriet reminded everyone. Brenda asked to borrow those exact rare roses days prior. She was refused. Suddenly, the same variety magically appears in her centerpieces. Suspicious. Brenda fumed, doubling down on her claim that the video was too blurry. Ms. Delgado and Mr. Hall conferred briefly. While not absolute forensic proof, the evidence was highly compelling. Combined with her prior request, it painted a damning picture. I calmly requested compensation for the stolen rose stems, rare cuttings not easily replaced. Brenda's eyes flashed with indignation. She realized she was cornered. Ms. Delgado indicated the board might fine or censure Brenda if found guilty. Furious, Brenda continued to maintain her innocence, but a flicker of panic crossed her face. After a short recess, the board returned with a decision. They stated that while the footage wasn't 100% definitive, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelmingly against Brenda. Ms. Delgado gently reminded Brenda of the HOA's code of conduct, which forbade board members from violating residents' property rights. They also cited the hypocrisy of her public stance on flower picking. In a measured tone, Mr. Hall explained that if Brenda refused to accept responsibility, the matter could escalate to legal channels outside the HOA's jurisdiction. None of that would help her standing. Cornered, Brenda still tried to save face, calling it a misunderstanding. But Ms. Delgado insisted on some restitution. The final compromise: Brenda must reimburse me for the cost of the rose cuttings, $200 per stolen stem, plus issue a written apology. The total came to around $1,200 for the 6 or so prime blooms. The board also threatened further disciplinary action if Brenda repeated such conduct. She was outraged, but had little choice. The HOA as a whole wouldn't back her, not after seeing that incriminating video. Fuming, she relented, cutting me a check on the spot. Harriet and I shared a quiet satisfaction, noting how swift the turn of fortune was. Brenda, who once threatened us all with fines for picking a single daisy, was paying up for trespassing and theft of private roses. The irony was thick enough to slice. As we left, Ms. Delgado assured me that a formal notice of censure would go into the board's files, and that they expected Brenda to sign an apology statement. Harriet whispered, "Word about this will spread like wildfire. The self-righteous bloom cop is a flower thief." I hoped it might deflate her tyrannical posture going forward. Brenda's written apology arrived in my mailbox a few days later. It was a stiff, one-paragraph note, reading, "I regret any confusion or distress regarding the recent flower misunderstanding. While my intentions were never to damage or steal property, I acknowledge that misunderstandings arose and have reimbursed you for any perceived losses. Sincerely, Brenda A." Her words barely admitted guilt. She used weasel phrases like misunderstanding and perceived losses, but it fulfilled the board's requirement. Harriet laughed at the note's insincerity. So typical of her, half-baked apology that implies no wrongdoing on her part. Meanwhile, rumors spread throughout Bloomfield Heights about how the revered flower enforcer had stolen roses. Neighbors gossiped at the mailbox or while walking dogs. "Did you hear? Brenda literally snuck in at night to pick from that new resident's yard." Some were aghast, others found it hilarious. Harriet reported that at the supermarket, A friend told her how Brenda's grand party was overshadowed by the whisper that the stunning pink centerpieces were stolen from a neighbor's garden. The scandal stuck to Brenda like glue. Still, she kept a brave face in public, continuing to patrol with notepad in hand, albeit less aggressively. She no longer championed harsh penalties for picking communal flowers. The hypocrisy was too glaring. How could she fine a child for plucking daisies after she'd filched private roses for her fancy event? Harriet joked that we might see the removal of those "no picking" signs eventually, now that Brenda realized how silly she looked enforcing it. For me, I used the $1,200 restitution to invest in some top-tier gardening supplies and replace the missing rose stems, hoping to coax more blooms for the next season. The sweet irony. Karen inadvertently funded the expansion of my prized rose garden. In the following weeks, things settled into a new normal. I tended my roses with renewed vigor, sometimes adding new varieties, always mindful that someone might try to filch them again. Harriet teased me about installing a second camera, just in case. But it seemed Brenda had learned her lesson. She avoided confrontation, passing by my yard quickly, rarely making eye contact. Neighbors continued to chat about the fiasco. The same lady who threatened a child for picking a wildflower stole a half-dozen private roses? Priceless. The story became part of Bloomfield Heights lore, repeated whenever someone new moved in. Some cynics questioned whether the restitution sum was too high, but Harriet reminded them these were rare heirloom roses, not cheap grocery store blooms. And the principle mattered. Property is property, no matter how small. Brenda's social standing took a noticeable hit. A few of her close allies on the board distanced themselves, unwilling to back her contradictory stance. Ms. Delgado discreetly told me that Karen's future proposals for new draconian flower rules had little traction, as no one wanted to be associated with her hypocrisy. It was a small but meaningful shift in the neighborhood's dynamic, loosening her once ironclad grip. As for me, I found a new serenity in my garden. Each dawn, I'd step outside, greet the fresh rosebuds, and chuckle at the memory of how Brenda inadvertently taught Bloomfield that forcing overreaching flower rules doesn't justify ignoring basic respect for someone's property. Harriet once summarized it perfectly. She tried to be queen of the blooms, but ended up dethroned by her own greedy snips. About a month later, I had a curious encounter. One late afternoon, I was trimming away spent petals when Brenda appeared on the sidewalk. I tensed, expecting another cold stare. But she hesitated, then cleared her throat. "Good evening," she said, voice subdued. I turned, greeted her neutrally. She paused, eyes flicking over the fresh buds. "Your roses are impressive." They seemed to have recovered from the, incident. A faint flush crept onto her cheeks. Despite her formal apology, this felt like her first real admission of guilt or contrition. I nodded. "Yes, they're resilient. I replaced a few stems you took." My tone wasn't entirely friendly, but I kept it civil. She fiddled with her notepad, then said quietly, "I suppose I let my eagerness for floral arrangements get the better of me. My party demanded a special touch, but I shouldn't have violated your yard. I regret that." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it held more sincerity than her letter. I exhaled. "I appreciate you saying that now. Honestly, if you'd asked nicely and not forced the entire neighborhood to abide by your picking bans, maybe we could have worked something out. But going behind my back was crossing a line." She lowered her gaze, nodding. "Yes, it was. I let my personal desires overshadow the rules I claimed to uphold." With that, she offered a stiff parting wave and walked on. Harriet peeked over from her porch, eyebrows arched. An actual hint of humility from Ms. Brenda? That's a first. While I wouldn't call us friends, the tension slightly thawed. She no longer singled me out for any petty compliance checks. I suspect she realized her moral authority in Bloomfield was shot. Meanwhile, my precious roses thrived, unmolested. Harriet joked that each new bloom reminded Brenda of her misdeeds, a living symbol of accountability. Seasons rolled forward, and my rose garden became a local talking point. Neighbors often dropped by with coffee or snacks, enjoying the scents and colors. I freely gifted cuttings to Harriet and a few others who admired them, secure in the knowledge that generosity fosters goodwill, unlike Karen's forced approach. The story of the stolen roses lingered in Bloomfield Heights' collective memory, retold with varying degrees of drama. People shook their heads at the irony of the flower protection zealot, swiping prized blooms for her personal event. Over time, the "no picking" signs near the communal daisies quietly disappeared. The board, apparently, decided enforcement wasn't worth the ill will. If children occasionally plucked a daisy or two, so be it. The community realized that such draconian rules were less about preserving flowers and more about one person's power trip. Freed from that oppressive climate, a renewed sense of neighborly warmth blossomed. Harriet's yard thrived with new plantings, and folks even started a small flower exchange group for seeds and cuttings, fostering the horticultural spirit that an HOA should ideally encourage. Brenda remained on the board, but her tone changed, adopting more caution. She no longer delivered scathing speeches about petty offenses. Instead, she'd focus on genuine concerns like sidewalk cracks or budget transparency. Many suspected the stolen roses scandal taught her humility. As Harriet put it, once you're caught on camera with pruners in your hand, you learn not to preach too loudly about minor code infractions. On lovely mornings, I still walk among my roses, inhaling the sweet fragrance, remembering how they once lured a self-proclaimed guardian of flowers into a foolish act. In the end, the biggest bloom to flourish from that fiasco was a sense of justice in Bloomfield Heights. We discovered that tyranny disguised as community standards could wilt under the sunlight of truth. And for me, the stolen blossoms, though heartbreaking at first, led to a stronger, more admired garden, ironically funded by Brenda's forced restitution. Sometimes Harriet joins me, recounting the saga with a smirk. She ranted about people who pick flowers, but ended up picking the best ones herself. Classic Karen. We share a laugh, thankful that the fiasco ended well. My roses stand as a testament to resilience, a proud symbol that no matter how controlling an HOA or a single board member might be, a community can rally around fairness. And yes, occasionally call out the irony of a bloom thief who once demanded we never pick a petal.